Hello and welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I am your co-host Giulia Bottaro, and today I am about to play an interview that I did with Patrick Donati, who is a co-founder and managing director of solar power producer Terrawatt. Terrawatt was founded in 2021 and is developing a portfolio of solar farms in Italy, and it's actually close to bringing the first one on the ground. In this really wide ranging chat, we have discussed a few issues around developing the solar power industry in the EU and specifically in Italy, a country famous for its sun, which, however, doesn't have a government that seems to make it easy to scale up an industry that will draw energy from said sun. Italy is famous for its complicated bureaucracy, and on top of that, there have been policies that are not supporting the solar power sector and indeed are hindering it. One that we talk about is the DL Agricoltura, which seems to favor the use of agricultural land for food production rather than solar panels, even though a study has found that only 1% of agricultural land is needed to build enough solar farms that would power the entire renewable energy needs of the country. So it's a bit of a challenging situation there, but Patrick is very optimistic and says the industry is booming, which is a relief because we need that. We need that to create job opportunities in areas affected by poverty and by brain drain. We need that to achieve the EU's renewable targets. We also discussed the economics of utility scale solar, installing batteries, using green hydrogen as storage, and also the various differences and similarities across the various countries of the bloc. So without further ado, here's our interview with Patrick. Hello, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start by you telling me a bit about your work, what you do?
Yeah, for sure. So currently I am managing director at Terrawatt. Terrawatt is a small renewable energy developer and IPP that's operating on the Italian territory. So we started 2 years ago. Essentially, we actually founded the company, I think, a week before the war in Ukraine broke out, which then sent power prices soaring and kind of caused all the issues that we now know, which turned out to be actually a great accelerator for our work in renewables. The reason why we kind of started this company was because we'd identified that there was lots of potential for growth in Italy, given the EU targets that had been set already at that time for 2030 and 2050, and sort of the lack of work that had been done for many reasons in Italy up to that point. So then once we actually founded the company and then the war in Ukraine broke out, that turned what was supposed to be like a 5-10-year business plan or even a 20-year business plan into a 3-year business plan. Because of all the accelerations that the government and sort of the overarching European government put in place. So essentially what I do is try to find new land, try to develop it, so get all the various permits to get to realize our solar farms, or now we're starting with wind farms as well, and we're also doing some utility scale storage, so the large scale batteries. And then also try to get it built and sell the energy into the grid, or in some cases also sell them off to other developers or other players who are interested in building them if we aren't, essentially.
Okay, amazing. I think there is already a lot to unpack from this one question. Maybe I would just start for our listeners that are not familiar with the EU targets, if you could expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, for sure. So essentially, it kind of all began, I think, with the Paris agreements. Where sort of, I guess, the world started to realize that climate change was going to be a thing, and that we were going to have to do something about it, right? And so then gradually this kind of started getting crystallized into what we're now calling the net zero journey, right? So essentially, like the way it works within the EU is that we, by law, now every country has to decarbonize their economies by 2050. They have like these targets that they have to reach. And decarbonization in this case, through the path of net zero, means removing the emissions that you're able to remove and compensating for those that you can't, right? And this then has an interim target of 2030, whereby we have to decarbonize around 50% of our economies, right? And essentially the way this works is that every country tries to invest into these decarbonization, and every company operating in these countries has to work on decarbonizing their work and their supply chain. And essentially, the way that this is going to work is pretty much entirely through shifting from burning fossil fuels, whether that's in cars, in industrial production, or in the generation of energy, to switching to electrification or other forms which do not have greenhouse gas emissions. Essentially, so I think if we want to summarize, like, we have to get to more or less 50% renewable energy generation by 2030, and then pretty much 100% renewable energy generation by 2050. Now, also, these targets are a moving target because you'll see that it keeps coming out in the news that groups of countries will come together and they'll pledge to double, triple, quadruple their renewable energy targets. So essentially, I think if we want to look at it from what is the spirit of what we're trying to do, it's essentially as a society, as a species, we're now trying to race to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And we're actually having some pretty remarkable success especially in these last 2 years, given the progress that we've had over the last decade, for instance.
And you mentioned earlier the war in Ukraine. So that was obviously an external driver beyond, outside of the internally set targets. Have there been any external drivers like this one?
I think in recent history, no. That was the biggest shock, but it was because it kind of took the issue of energy generation away from kind of this conceptual of, we should probably do something or the climate will get worse, to a practical businesses cannot survive with these energy prices, right? Because Europe had a huge reliance on Russian gas, Italy in particular, and energy prices went so high that a lot of businesses were saying, we can't stay working, right? We can't keep going. There was famously the story of the fisherman who said, we can't operate our boats profitably, so we can't go out and fish. Right, and that's an example of an entire industry that got stopped because of how high petrol prices had gone at that point, or gasoline prices, or whatever it was. So that was a really, really big shakeup, which then sort of forced like political and also what's called social will to pay attention to these issues, and then kickstarted all of this process towards simplifying and sort of pushing towards renewable development.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And going back to Europe then, how is it going? What's the progress made so far?
It's patchy. I think that's the best way to put it. I think, this kind of shows it shows the bureaucratic breaks that exist in certain countries, and actually the strength of having a cohesive and clear legislative framework in other countries, right? What do I mean by this? So I think Germany has been the largest installer of renewable energy in the last decade, right? Now, obviously, Germany has access to lots of wind, which other sort of countries in Europe don't necessarily have, because they have all the wind coming in from the North Sea. So that's one factor for sure. But what is the other factor is that in Germany, it's actually very simple and straightforward to apply for permits, to get these permits obtained and get them approved, and then to actually build your renewable farms. In fact, I think on solar, Germany has been one of the largest installers in Europe. Countries like Italy, on the other hand, have been very slow. I think we've had a target of, if we have to hit our 2030 targets, we'd have to install, if I'm not mistaken, 8 gigawatts a year. And I don't think we've even hit 6 or 5, I think was as many as we've installed in 2023. So we're pretty far behind. But why? Is it because Italy doesn't have sun, or it's not an attractive investment area? No, it's because the legislative framework and the legislative process is extremely slow. It can take up to 3 to 4 years to get a solar farm just authorized, right, in some cases. And then building it takes another year. So it can be up to 5 years until your solar farm is actually like plugged in and producing. And this is because developers have to manage like a very opaque sort of layers of regulations to try to get through to get these actually approved. Not to mention the fact that now recently the Italian government has pushed through legislation that's aimed at slowing down the rollout of solar on the Italian territory. So it's patchy, essentially. That's the answer.
Okay. Again, a lot to unpack from this answer, but obviously I'm Italian and I'm interested in what's going on in my country. So what is this legislation exactly? Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Sure. So there's been 2 elements, right? So the first one has been the DL Agricoltura. Essentially what they did is in May, something like that, the Italian government put out what is a DL. So it's an emergency legislation, right? Which is sort of for times of crisis. Essentially, they put out the law and it becomes binding. They then debate it in parliament and see if they want to convert it into actual permanent law. over like a period of time, right? And this was all aimed as a support package for the agriculture industry, which include, loads of different measures, which were supposed to kind of support it because there was problems of drought that they had to counter. There were problems with like invasive species. There was loads of things that were included in that bill. But also there was a ban on ground mount solar farms on agricultural land, right? Now, just quickly for listeners who might not be aware, ground mount solar is essentially the type of solar that you see generally if you're out into the countryside, and you see the solar panels actually mounted on the ground. They might be stationary or they might be rotating with the sun. Those are the two kind of types that you might have. And generally, like the land on which this is built is agricultural land, right? Because it's sort of, there's loads, it's cheaply available, and you can have these like sort of wide expanses of solar panels, right? And that's actually the cheapest form of energy that you can have, because given like the economics of solar farms, the larger you do your installations, the cheaper it costs to produce each individual unit of energy, right? And so essentially what the Italian government said is that you can't do that anymore. If you want to develop solar farms on agricultural land, there's like a very, very narrow strip of legislative strip, let's call it, like a very like sort of legally narrow type of land on which you can do that development, right? And everything else, you have to do what they call advanced agrivoltaics, right? Which is a form of solar which combines agriculture and solar, but with very specific technical requirements, right? So the solar panels have to be at least 2 meters high. You have to have certain types of cultures, certain types of controls, and it's quite involved. I won't go into all the details. But essentially what this meant was that it kind of pulled like a huge handbrake on the development, because in this period within which the law was announced, it was then published and became legally binding and then was debated and converted into law. I think most developers like me kind of stopped, right? Because we said, wow, this has now created a huge uncertainty in the legislative framework. How can we make new investments when the law is constantly changing, and we're faced with a change that's actually making it more difficult for us to develop these solar farms? The central argument that is kind of put forward is that solar is taking away land from agriculture, right? And to a certain extent, that's true in the sense that once you build a ground mount solar farm on that piece of land, you obviously can't farm it anymore, right? I mean, you could also like be creative and sort of make it have, I don't know, you could have sheep eat the grass underneath, and that's something that people often do. But there was an EU body which came out with a report recently that spoke about how at an EU-wide level, in order to reach our 2030 targets, we would need less than 2% of total EU land, right? And this was a study that was then repeated in Italy, which shows that actually, if we wanted to do all of our targets, we would need less than 1% of total agricultural land, right? We would need something like, I think, 200,000 hectares, more or less. And there's something like 4 million completely abandoned hectares of agricultural land, right? So, I mean, it's difficult to see sort of what exactly we're trying to accomplish here from that point of view.
Yeah, I think that the thing of the abandon is what I was thinking about, because as far as I'm aware, there is a lot of abandoned land, especially in the south, because people, the south of Italy is an area with economic and social issues, and often people go elsewhere to find work. And so it seems like a good opportunity to give new value to that land and provide new work opportunities in areas that have been struggling. So I'm also struggling to see the need for this law, really. I mean, what was the main reason? Was it just because, as you said, we needed to make food, like we need to grow crops?
Essentially, it's this. Now, whether or not this is sort of the reason that then is going to kind of keep this law in place, this was the reason that was given to push this forward, right? It was like, we need to stop the depredation of the Italian territory from these solar developers. But you see this everywhere. You see this also in Sardinia, for instance. There's been like a huge campaign discussing this, essentially saying like, oh, they're coming here and they're taking our land, and it's these big multinationals. But in the end, like the main point that I like to make is, no one's forcing anyone to enter into these contracts, right? No one's coerced. No one's, if you don't want to do solar, you can keep farming. That's completely fine. But from my personal experience, speaking to farmers, they are so happy to give a part of their land over to us to do these solar farms. Because what kind of deal do we offer them? We offer them either we buy the land from you outright, or we rent it from you for a period of 30 years, right? And if you speak to any farmer, they will tell you that over the last decade, farming has become a much riskier enterprise, right? Because climate has become unstable, right? And so you have these agricultural companies who are actually struggling to close the year, because it's not like you have a constant cash flow, right? You work, you grow the crops, then you sell them, and you get your money from the year from maybe like those 1, 2, 3 crop sales that you make a year, right? And if one of those yields is not doing well, then you have a big problem, right? So instead, having a constant cash flow that's coming in every year, and it's going to be exactly the same every year, and there's no variation from this. I mean, unless there's like a huge tragedy, that every year you're going to be getting your however many thousands of euros from the rental of that land. That actually adds a lot of stability to them, and it allows them to keep doing their work. Because otherwise, they're just going to. A lot of them have said to me, "We're just going to have to shut down if this keeps going."
That's insane.
Yes,
that's crazy. And
it is.
It all fits together. It's climate change, disrupting agriculture, and then if we switch to renewable energy, then hopefully climate change will be ever so slightly mitigated, and then agriculture will be more stable. So it goes full circle, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that you do solar, but if people have a problem with solar, why, for example, not invest in wind? Because we have a lot of coastline in Italy.
Yes. So actually, in Italy, there aren't that many spots that have enough wind flow to develop wind farms, right? There's a few, and generally the ones that have been already tapped, but like decades ago, right? If you've ever taken a car to drive between Campania and Puglia, right, going through either Basilicata or Molise, you are going to see an infinity of wind farms, because that's basically the only area where there actually is wind,
right? Okay.
Or there's good enough wind. Now we're talking about offshore wind, but I mean, it becomes a little bit technically complicated, and also like it's we're a quite small developer. It's beyond our capabilities. Like this is where like the very large funds can come in and risk spending those however many millions on the development and then the construction for these large installations. So we focus on like the stuff that we can actually execute, which are like sort of the medium scale solar, and maybe also some onshore wind if we find the right space. But I guess to add one more point, solar remains the cheapest form of energy available, right? And this is a crucial point. Everywhere. If you compare it to any other form of energy generation, utility scale solar is the cheapest, but for one very simple reason, which is that it's the simplest thing to build and to maintain, right? If you want to think about what solar is technically, it's rods in the ground, a horizontal rod connecting them, and then these solar panels that are basically attached, basically like Legos, right? That they go onto these rods. And now if you add the motor, so you have the tracker, so it goes east to west, it costs a little bit more. If you have them fixed, it costs a little bit less, but it produces a little bit less. But it has the lowest, it's called LCOE, levelized cost of energy, of any other form of energy generation. And it's also the easiest to build, maintain, just develop. It's the simplest. It's the easiest win that we can have in the energy transition. So there's really no reason to delay or to push it back, especially because when it comes to land occupation, as we said, we're only going to need less than 2% of the available land, right?
Yeah, definitely. And when you were talking earlier about agricultural land, are there any other types of land where you can build, or is it maybe those type of awkward places where it's hard to get to? Maybe agricultural land is the easiest one.
Well, agricultural land is generally the most widely available land. And the reason why this is important is because it's not just about what type of land you're building on. It's also about, especially in Italy, what constraints there are on that land, right? So I'm going to give you a very simple example, actually one that happened to me. We were looking at developing a plot of agricultural land, and it was perfect. It was this beautiful flat plain. It was like in the middle of nowhere. There was no one to complain. And then we found out that it was contained. So basically, like on one side, there was like, because it was within 50 meters of a body of water, and there was no water in this body, right? It was just like registered on the map as a body of water, we couldn't develop for those 50 meters, right? And then on the other side, there was another part, which I can't remember exactly what type of a constraint it was, but there was another constraint that ate another 50% of the land. And then there was another constraint. And so you have all of these issues that prevent you from developing in certain areas. So yes, there are lots of types of land that you can develop on. You can develop on industrial land. You can develop on this used mines and landfill, and essentially that's it. If you want to do it on the ground, but you then have to go and see what the law says that you can actually do there, right? You can't just build wherever you want.
Yeah. I see what you mean.
So that's essentially the issue.
And talking about targets in Europe, sounds like Italy is a little bit behind maybe other countries like Germany. What happens if one of the countries doesn't meet the 2030 requirements?
Let's not think about that, right? Because we all want that to happen, and I think everyone's working towards that. I'll be honest, I actually don't know what the specific consequences would be. I know that there are definitely some PNRR funds that are tied to reaching these targets. So there's definitely be losing that funding. And I think to a certain extent, there's also other legal repercussions that will be like felt by the countries that don't hit these targets. But let's just go on the assumption that we will get there because everyone's working towards that, right? And this is something I was speaking to some other operators talking about this. It's that everyone is just ready to work. Everyone has the willpower. There's the capital. There's the manpower. There's everything that we need to make this happen. We just need to like actually have a strong regulatory framework that allows us to get to these, that allows us to do our job, basically.
Yeah, but it doesn't sound very strong if you can't build on agricultural land.
Well, okay, again, it changes what you can and can't do, right? So it means that now we'd have to, if we want to develop an agricultural land, we'd have to do agrivoltaics, right?
Right.
Not that you absolutely can't. There are some areas where you absolutely can't, and those are the areas that are considered high quality agriculture. And so you're not allowed to. You're not even allowed to go close, or like the areas of outstanding natural beauty, or if you're like in like a natural park or whatever. Like there's certain areas where you absolutely can't, right? But as I said, there are some areas where you are still allowed to develop on agricultural land. It's a very, as I said, legislatively narrow thing. So it's something like 300 meters from a railway, 500 meters from an existing industrial park, or a series of other conditions. So you can still do it, but it becomes just a lot more difficult to get these projects done.
I see. But if there is a will, there is a way.
Yes, and also if there's an EU, I think there's a way, right? Because this goes against the RED 2 directive, or the RED 3 directive. I can't remember exactly which one, which came out. I think basically just before just after the Agricoltura came out, essentially saying that you're not allowed to make blanket bans on the development of renewables, and if any limitation has to be targeted to a specific issue. So I mean, we're also observing to see what's going to happen in the next few months. With regards to this, and if there's going to be any kind of EU intervention.
Yeah, it sounds like a regulatory headache. And we've spoken about Italy mostly, but obviously the EU has a lot of countries within it. So the issue that we discussed so far is relatively unique to Italy, I imagine. Are there any overarching challenges across the bloc about getting to the targets that we need to get to?
Yes, and it's actually very funny because I've attended several conferences this year, and I've always kind of told the story of my experience of developing in Italy. And it's amazing because maybe you kind of have this idea that elsewhere it's different and elsewhere it's better. It's not, because everywhere has the exact same problems. It might not be these specific issues that we are facing, but the experience that I hear from sort of my counterparts is regulatory issues, grid connections, power prices. It's all the same issues that we have everywhere. Like delays in permitting, delays in being able to get a grid connection, delays in being able to actually physically connect yourself to the grid rather than just getting a quote. And I think this is essentially universal. Like, what would be the best thing for the energy transition just globally is just to have a simple, streamlined regulatory process, which means that we can very quickly get all of the approvals that we require, right? And actually, this generally tends to happen in some northern European countries where I guess the development is done for the developers, right? So the government will say, okay, these are the areas where you can and can't build. If you want to build, we can auction this off to you. right? And so you get this by auction. So you just have to go. That's a whole also has a whole other process that has its own headaches rather than developers doing their own development. But it definitely means it goes by faster.
Yeah. So so here we've got the EU, that is the regulatory body at the highest level, giving orders, but then ultimately it's down to the individual countries to have their own processes to allow permitting and allow developers to build. Okay. Is there any good examples that you can think of that you think countries like Italy should take inspiration from?
Well, I mean, as I said, everywhere has their own issues. I think that probably, as we said, Germany has been very quick in being able to make these developments. So I think obviously Germany is quite a good example in the sense that, like, I think, whereas like we have in Italy, you have certain timings that public bodies need to respect, right? And they often don't respect them. Like, so they go past that time to give you an answer. And like, I guess it's quite interesting. So in Italy, we've now developed or there has been a form of authorization called the PAS, which is the Procedura Autorizzativa Semplificata, Simplified Approval Procedure, which basically means that you prepare your documentation, you send it to the body that needs to review it, and if they don't answer within 30 days, then it's basically a yes, right? It's a tacit yes, right? And it's very interesting because I tried to explain this to some investors, especially Northern European ones, who just can't wrap their head around the concept that you don't get a piece of paper that says you're approved, right? And I have to explain to them, no, this is better because if you want to wait for the piece of paper, the process becomes way longer. And oftentimes it can take years, right? Rather than these 30 days or whatever it might be, right? Whereas in Germany, actually, I think I was reading it can take essentially like a year to get a solar farm developed. But it actually is 1 year. So they actually tend to respect these times. So that's, I think, what again is very helpful for developers, having like a clarity on, we submit this paperwork and we're going to get an answer within the given time.
Yeah, I suppose it's always, when we talk about sustainability targets in general and changes in policy, all that business want is certainty. Right.
Yes, that's it.
So they can do their thing, that make their strategy and act against it.
Yeah. A small anecdote is that in around 2012, so actually, if I'll still take a further step back, when you look at Italy's renewable energy capacity, actually, we started off very strong pre-2000s because we installed loads of hydropower, right? So Italy had loads of hydropower plants, and that's around, I think, 50 gigawatts, if I'm not mistaken, of capacity. And then everything else that we built since then has been with wind and solar, roughly speaking, right? And the development was actually going really well until then. Around 2012, the government basically made a retroactive incentives cut, right? So they basically said, like, we've been paying a certain incentive rate to you, and businesses were already receiving this incentives rate. So as in, like, it's a support mechanism, right? Basically saying, on top of whatever power price you're getting, we're going to pay you, the government pays you X to incentivize this development. And they basically retroactively said, no, actually, we changed our minds. We're not paying you this incentive rate anymore. We're changing the way it's spread out, right? And a lot of businesses then struggled, and I think quite a few also went under, because essentially, like, you can't change the rules halfway through the game, which is what they did. And so that kind of ground the renewable development in Italy to a huge halt. And very few new installations were made after that period until the war in Ukraine and everything kind of has been developing over the last few years.
So did they claw back the money that people had been receiving as well?
They changed the period over which people got paid.
Okay.
And that meant that, like, I don't remember precisely, but it was something like they went from paying things over 25 years instead of 20 years, right? And obviously then that changed how people were doing their cash flows. And that changed the business case in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And for people who maybe hadn't planned their finances well, that changed also, like, how they were going to be making their money. And so put people in a bit of difficulty.
Yeah, I can see why people have been discouraged to enter the space. So why did you do that?
Because I kind of, like, it was sort of like a risk that I saw on my side, but one that I thought would pay off, which was like, we're going to have to do these targets, right? Because what I thought to myself at the time was, all right, we have these targets. Italy's really far behind, but eventually the whole world is going to wake up to the fact that we have to do this, right? And actually now I think you realize, I mean, we can see it that relative to 5 years ago, for instance, climate change has become much more prominent in like public discourse, right? Like people are now aware that this is what's happening, right? Like it's hard to look at what's happening with our weather and read what's happening in the news and not say, okay, wow, the climate has changed, right? And it's only going to be a matter of time until public opinion starts to really shift towards wanting to have concrete action towards this, right? I mean, unless somehow we manage to convince people, like somehow people manage to be convinced that it's not actually a problem, but I don't see how you can, because people will see their quality of life degrade over the next 10 years. And it's already starting to happen. I don't know if you saw that last year, prices for olive oil went sky high, but that's because we just could not produce enough olive oil, right? Ask any farmer. The harvest was terrible, and they weren't able to create the yields that they were expecting. And this is what's going to start happening to most natural products and most elements of our lifestyles over the next decade if the climate continues to change in this way.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we have to pay crazy prices for energy whilst, and spend the disposable income that we could spend on olive oil that has been harvested, because it's more expensive. And it's all full circle again.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so how have you found starting an energy company and entering this space that is, as old as time, maybe not as old as time, but it's certainly quite old as an industry to be a startup?
Yeah, it has been a challenge. That's for sure. It has been a pretty strong challenge. Particularly because I spent most of my life in the UK prior to moving to Italy, so I was getting used to a completely different work culture. That was challenge number one. And then the other challenge that it's not. How can I put this? Like, it's not for beginners. In the sense that, like, let's say, if you want to start selling fruit, let's say, right? You say, I want to open a fruit business, right? You buy the fruit from someone, you take it to the store, you sell it, or you open your own store and you sell it, and that's fine, right? And then if it starts going well, you accumulate your cash, you open a new fruit store and you start buying more fruit, and you can kind of expand that way, right? Here, it's not like that, because there's essentially a book like this of laws that you need to know and of regulations that you need to navigate, and everything needs to be perfect. And there's so much time and work that you need to put in before you actually start to see a result, right? This is a business where you have to work for 3 or 4 years, as I was saying, before you start to actually see your solar farm on the ground for sort of the bigger ones. It can be a little less time for the smaller ones. So I came into this because I'd done corporate finance advisory in renewable energy before. And I came in thinking, oh yes, of course, like it's going to be a breeze. And it was not a breeze, but it was also really rewarding because we're close to getting our first solar farm on the ground after almost 2 years of work, which is very, very exciting. Hopefully this year we're going to open our first construction site.
Exciting. Well, tell me about that then. That's really good news.
Yeah, it is really good news. So it's been a fight, as everything obviously is in Italy, because you're fighting against regulations, you're fighting against everyone. But after these 2 years, this is a small 1 megawatt solar farm, which we authorized through the PAS mechanism, which is going to be in a little town in the center of Italy. And it's going to create enough. I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but it's going to create enough energy for around 3,000 homes in the area, which is great. It's great to know that we're having this small little impact.
Yeah, definitely.
Already now.
And are you on to the next project yet?
Yes. Well, we have currently around 20 projects totaling around 250 megawatts. That we're bringing forward. And these are all projects that we're working in parallel, right? So the first project that's going to be authorized is this 1 megawatt that I was mentioning. We're going to have a second megawatt authorized probably around the same time. And we're going to open that construction site either late this year or early next year. And then in the pipeline for next year, we have around another 15 to 20 megawatts that we're going to be building. So we did a lot of the kind of like the groundwork and the grinding out over the last couple of years, and now we're starting to slowly reap the rewards, which is very satisfying.
Yeah, I bet. So do you find that farmers are more inclined to speak to you as a small business owner, or a larger company with more experience, more infrastructure?
So that's I'd say it depends. right? Generally, I think Italy is a country where you can't really go and knock on someone's door with a briefcase full of money because there is a lot of diffidence towards strangers, I would say, right? This is that's just kind of the culture here. Like everything kind of goes by recommendations and by networking, right? Especially if you go into the south. The further south you go, the more true this is. So I think to a certain extent, that they prefer the fact that they speak to me because I am kind of not the ultimate decision maker, but I am very close to being the ultimate decision maker. And I tend to be the only point of interface that they have with the company. And if they call me, I kind of have my finger across everything, so I can sort of help or sort of give, clear direction, right? Rather than then speaking to the, business development manager who has to speak to his director, who then maybe has to go speak to the CEO. And there's all these different layers and stuff. I think it depends. On the other hand, some people might think, like I'm going to work with Enel or Eni or whoever is like the big energy company, and that's more of a name that they recognize, and so they're more happy to go with that.
Okay, so a mixed bag.
A mixed bag. I'm going to say in general though that most farmers that I've spoken to, let's be clear though, we're not just talking about like big industrial farmers, right? We're also talking about and one of the stories that I see the most going around the country is the grandparent of the family who lives still in the town where their family have been for generations, who has kids who moved to the big cities either in Rome or in Milan, or even near the nearby city to work, and aren't interested in working their plot of land that they've had for however many generations. And the grandkids also now either live in Rome or in Milan or in London or in New York or wherever they've kind of moved on to try to find something else. And so they say, okay, well, look, I've got this plot of land that I've been trying to work that I'd like to get something out of. Buy it from me or rent it from me so I can give a steady income to my family, to my kids, right? This is essentially the counterparty that we have a lot. And also big sort of industrial, or let's call them professional farmers, but there's lots of these kind of smaller hobby farmers who we're working with.
Okay, yeah, it's what we were saying earlier about creating new opportunities and reinventing the resources that we have. And with the brain drain that there is in Italy, I think it is very important to find creative ways to provide opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, if anyone wants to sort of come back and work in Italy, I think this is, especially the work in energy, this is going to be the decade, because there is such a shortage of skilled, talented labor, whether it's in the people building these farms or it's in the people designing them or whatever it is, right? There is a wealth of opportunity for people wanting to work in the energy space in Italy. There's so much growth that we have to do.
Okay, so would you say it's booming?
Yes, yes, okay. Absolutely. It's absolutely booming.
Despite the bureaucracy issues, the industry is still booming.
Yes, but I think you can extend that to kind of the whole of Italy, I would say, right? Not just the energy space. Despite the bureaucracy issues, Italy is one of the largest economies in the world, right? And I often like to imagine, what would we be able to do if we didn't have this bureaucratic break? Like where would we be? Would we be bigger than the States? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, we are as big as California.
Yeah.
Roughly, right? Mm-hmm. I had another question about being a startup in the energy space. Mm-hmm. Are you sort of an outlier, or are there many startups roughly the same, stage of growth as you?
Yeah, there's quite a few. That I would say, but I think this is an industry that's dominated by giants, right? So, I mean, the energy game is, as you said, a very ancient game, and it's and the renewables game is also sort of like a quite mature industry by this point, and it's sort of dominated by large scale developers, pension funds, large institutional investors who are deploying billions and billions and billions. And if you read in the news, you'll see like all these deals for like hundreds of millions, billions, whatever, to try and develop all these like new wind farms, solar farms, because there's lots of capital kind of flowing in. So like us little guys, let's call it, yes, there are, but like they tend to sort of have quite a short-lived life in the sense that like they're either like developing their projects, getting the money, then getting out and doing other things, or they tend to be acquired by larger players who want to buy up the whole portfolio.
And how do you envisage your future then? among these options?
Well, I'd like to try and make this a business for the rest of my life, right? I'm definitely going to want to work in energy, and I definitely believe that if we can build our portfolio here, then there's no reason why we can't expand it into other things. Now, will we ever become as big as? And it'll probably not, right? But I see a clear path towards building this in the future, and then if not, we can always exit, and I can try and do something else in the renewable energy space.
One final question. What do you think about green hydrogen and the use of electricity for green hydrogen? And I'm asking that because to produce green hydrogen, we need a lot of electricity, but at the moment, we also need electricity to electrify other parts of the economy. So, how do you envisage electricity being produced and used to then produce the green hydrogen?
So that's actually a really good question. The answer is obviously it depends, right? Because as you say, right, we need electricity and we need sort of clean electricity to power, all of our world, right? All of like sort of the electronics and whatever industrial processes it is that we're using. But there is a limit to the production of renewable energy, a limitation, let's call it, which is that it's not necessarily always produced when it's needed, right? So let me explain. Every solar farm will produce its energy at exactly the same time, right? And it's not, so it will start at, whenever sun rises, right? It will start, the curve will kind of begin, then it'll peak around midday or sort of somewhere around there, and then it'll start to fade off, right? But not all energy consumption occurs following this curve, right? Because once the energy is created, it's either used or it's lost. That's essentially the issue. So this is why we talk about storage, right? And so having like these large batteries attached to your solar farms, or whatever these might be, in order to then store that energy in those moments of peak time, right? When maybe the price is too low, because obviously, if everyone's selling electricity at the same time, the price goes down, especially if it's not being consumed. So you might then divert it into the battery and then use it later during the night or in any other thing. And the same thing can happen with hydrogen, right? So you could then use hydrogen as a point of storage for this excess energy that's not actually going anywhere otherwise, right? So this is kind of like also the game to balance a little bit, right? Where you say, okay, so what are we going to use this electricity for? Well, sometimes it goes to waste, literally, right? Because there's just no one using it on the other end. This is kind of like, what's called kind of peak load management, right? So that's one side. On the other side, actually, you can then have electricity, so have renewable energy specifically for green hydrogen. But why? It's because actually there's some industrial processes that you can't electrify. For instance, it's like the giant furnaces that they use to smelt iron, right, or to smelt steel. Those can't be electrified, right? You're going to have to use some other kind of a gas, which now they're trying to use hydrogen or maybe putting hydrogen into the mix to be able to make this slightly greener. So actually, I mean, it's not necessarily in some cases a choice of one or the other. It's that you need to just realize that there's some processes will require this decision in order that you can actually reduce the carbon impact of these processes.
Yeah, I think the thing with the green hydrogen is that according to some people, it can be used for loads of applications, including applications where there are technologies based on electricity. So, for example, you could use technically hydrogen to warm your home or power your car, but then there is also heat pumps or electric cars.
Sure.
So I think it's the balance of finding the best use for green hydrogen without taking away that electricity from the grid, from those technologies that are already electrified and don't need hydrogen, if that makes sense. But it's, as you said, it's like, it depends. There is a balance that like you need the decision making up top, I suppose. Yeah,
for sure. Also, like, there are some applications where maybe hydrogen seems like a good idea, but it's probably not. For instance, cars is a good one, right? Because actually hydrogen molecules, they tend to leak. Sorry, they're quite small, so they tend to leak out of whatever container they're in. And also, like, it's quite heavy. It doesn't really work for smaller vehicles. It works for the really, really big ones, right? So you can use it for trains, you can use it for ships, but putting it in your car, as of now, like at least it hasn't really become commercially viable from what I've been able to understand. So for now, electric seems to be the type of vehicle that we prefer. Then for your home, I don't know about that. I can't comment because I've never considered heating my home with hydrogen. Maybe it's a good idea. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating conversation to have, really. And I was interested from the point of view of really how much electricity do we have?
Mm-hmm.
And, if we need to allocate it, then we need to decide
Mm-hmm.
where it should go, where it's the most effective use
Mm-hmm.
of electricity. Because obviously, when you produce hydrogen, a little bit of electricity is lost.
Yeah.
So, and I think that the use of green hydrogen as storage is actually quite good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And sometimes you have to make that choice, right? So you can build your solar farm specifically, or your wind farm specifically to create green hydrogen, right? You just locate it next to a water source, you attach it up to your electrolyzer, and you just create that green hydrogen. That's also entirely possible.
And talking about storage, do you have any plans to install storage at your farms? Or would that be an external party that you give it to?
So for now, no. I wouldn't invest in attaching storage to my farms, but for a very simple reason, which is that the economics at the moment don't really work out, right? Because Italy does not have enough of a fluctuation in power prices between like the sort of the highs and the lows for me right now to justify this investment, right? Because essentially, if you think about it, like to build a solar farm costs roughly 1 million per megawatt. And to build battery storage is going to be pretty much the same price, right? So you're doubling your investment, right? To then say, okay, so let's say I sell my energy at 100 at the peak and 80 at the lowest that I can sell it at. Instead, so I send it into the battery, right? And I try to get this margin, right? It's just not enough to justify it. To justify this doubling of the investment, right? It changes the payback profile by a lot. So the way storage does work a lot in Italy instead is as a standalone, right? So you basically have these batteries that are essentially like leased to the grid operator who uses them to manage the electricity load. So they will send the energy into the battery and then take it out when it's needed, right?
So is there a way for you to know whether the energy produced by your farm at peak time is lost or is being used or maybe put into storage?
So generally, it depends. There's a few different types of contracts that you can have. If you have them with a counterparty, you're sort of like selling it to them, right? If you can then sort of have other types of contracts where you're going to put into the grid and it's sent to market price. But actually, like for me specifically, there's no way to track where my electrons go, if that's what you're asking, right? Because they just kind of like, you can think about it like I'm just feeding into a lake, right? And then on the other end, someone else is taking out from that lake, right? But I mean, I guess the way you can think about it is that like, I know that I put in a certain amount into the lake lake manager knows as well. And then the other person took out a certain amount. So then you say, okay, so this was the exchange, right? But it's the same electrons for everyone.
I love the metaphor of the lake.
Yeah.
It works really well.
It does work. Yes.
Well, amazing. Yeah, these were all my questions, really. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about the topic?
I think we've covered basically like all of my gripes with what I do pretty well. As I said, I think the main message, if there's a message that I can get out, is that, everyone in this industry is ready and willing to work, and we are here and we're pushing. Just what would be really good, not just for us, but I think for the whole world at this point, for this energy transition that we're trying to do, is a clear, simple regulatory framework. That's all we ask for. It's simple to say, I think complicated to implement.
Okay, well, for the people in power, you've heard Patrick, please do provide a simple regulatory framework. Well, thank you so much for the great chat. It was really good to learn more about the solar space and get to know all the details as well, and all the fun, maybe, sometimes depressing anecdotes. So thanks so much. And to our listeners, don't forget to follow us on all our social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and we'll leave contacts to Patrick and Terrawatt in the show notes. See you next time.